interesting because there's something different which I'll try and tell you from this case. So let's look at the history. And 29-year-old amenorrhea, which is secondary, had elements of eating disorder and which was cured, was on the pill, and has had no periods. The pill has been stopped for years ago. An FSH of 3, LH of 0.1, E2 of 76, and a combined male factor infertility. So we proceeded to do IVF with ICSI, antral follicle count of 10. Have a look at the ovaries. And what I'll ask you to do is keep a good eye on the thecal element and not on just the follicular element. The thecal element gives you an idea of how good or bad is the pituitary function. It is LH dependent, and LH gives you an idea about the impact of LH and also which drugs may or may not work. So let's have a look at these follicles. Good sized follicles. I said again, good sized follicles are more likely to stimulate. So we started with HMG, and the reason why I started HMG is there's no LH. Type 1, you cannot give recombinant FSH. Please don't try giving it. You do not get mature eggs, and in fact, you may not get eggs in many cases. Day of trigger, the FSH was 22.3, and that's again, why do I measure FSH? And there's a reason to it. It tells me in the early part of the stimulation whether optimal FSH levels have been reached, or do I need to give more FSH? And the reason is FSH hovers around 20 to 25 at its maximum. And that's a maximum that it reaches in stimulation. It doesn't go beyond it. It's very rare to go beyond it. And the LH is still low. And there's no Frimidel here and no Cetrotide. And that's because it is a case of Hypo Hypog and there's no pituitary response. A decent estradiol, a progesterone less than 4. So I said, well, there's no harm testing the pituitary. I said, why don't we just go ahead and test the pituitary gland? And remember, it's a Hypo Hypog case. The pituitary is not going to respond. An analog trigger does not work. So I said, well, let us try and find out what type of Hypo Hypog this is. And it's not a very well-known way of doing it, but that is the way my thinking goes. And remember, I think I've probably understood where the Hypo Hypog element may be going. And that's how the ovaries looked. So I gave her a dual trigger, HCG, because you have to give HCG, and I gave her an analog trigger. Now, HCG does not increase LH, remember that. So her FSH went up to 53.8. Again, HCG does not increase FSH. So you see a huge rise of FSH. LH of 16.0, and so there's a suboptimal rise, but there is a rise. Progesterone of 27, and that's in line with HCG and not with analog trigger working, because progesterone tends to be higher. Estrogen stabilized. So we got 8 eggs and 3 blastocysts were frozen. So now let's look at the types of type 1. So there are 3 types of hypothalamic amenorrhea. One is hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is HA. The best one to have, and because there is secondary amenorrhea, BMI is low, FSH may be normal, LH is low, E2 is low, and you see like this scan, small follicles, sometimes multicystic ovaries, and sometimes PCO. Now, the more complex are the other 2 types. Second is HH, which is hypothalamic hypogonadism. Here, you see primary amenorrhea. FSH, LH, E2 is low, small ovaries, small uterus, and thin endometrium. The third is hypopituitarism. Now, in HH, you also see smaller, thinner endometrium. In hypopituitarism, you see primary or secondary amenorrhea, FSH, LH, E2 low, small uterus, and small ovaries. And these are the 2 which sometimes tend to be difficult to diagnose. So in this case, the case was in HA, hypothalamic amenorrhea, and that's why you see a much better response. You see a rise of FSH, which is not seen with HCG. You see a suboptimal rise of LH, clearly indicating that a pituitary response has happened. And it may help us to understand that the pituitary may work at some stage. When, how, I don't know. But this is quite an interesting case which throws light on hypo hypog conditions. Thank you very much.